and welcome to Murphy's Garden. So I just want to begin this week's video by saying a thank you to Olivia for doing last week's tour of the vegetable patch, and as you can see we have got a bountiful supply of fruit and veg, and it gave me the opportunity to deal with all the produce. So we've got courgettes coming out of our ears at the moment, but I was able to make quiches and pickles and string onions and all of those kind of things that needed to be done, because I really don't like to waste anything, because come the winter I think, oh, I had all those lovely courgettes and now I haven't got them, so I want to use every single one. And the other person I would like to thank is Danielle. Danielle is from the YouTube channel North Lawn Flower Farm in Pennsylvania, and Danielle very kindly asked me to be a guest on her channel, which I was honoured to be asked, and it was really fun filming a little video for her. And as a result, we've got quite a lot of her subscribers have come over to check out our garden and our channel, so welcome to all of you. And any of my subscribers who don't know about Danielle's channel, really recommend that you go and have a look. Danielle has been a great source of inspiration for me, particularly with growing and picking flowers, which is something that I never really did a lot of. I was never really that interested in it, so she's really ignited a new passion in me, so and I'm really enjoying that. But in this video I want to reflect on our recent visit to RHS Garden Bridgewater. I didn't know an awful lot about this garden prior to going, and in some ways that was really quite nice, because it was a really wonderful surprise when I went there, and it was so special. I was absolutely blown away with it. So if you haven't seen that video, watch that first perhaps before you watch this one, because it's lovely to just go and discover a new garden like we did for the first time, without any sort of expectations or preconceived ideas. And as you know from watching this channel, I love to go and visit other gardens, and I always come back with an idea or two, no matter what garden I visit and what size or what type, even if it's completely different to my own. I generally come back with an idea, but sometimes I come across a garden, stumble across a truly special garden which is rammed full with loads and loads of ideas, and I always know when this happens, because I have this sort of almost like a tingling excitement inside, and I can't wait to get back home and get in my shed and get my spade out and start digging and making changes to my own garden. And perhaps going forward we should have a code, and if we come across one of these gardens, we give it a spade rating, and I think a 5 spader is what this garden needs, RHS Bridgewater, because it was full of lots of wonderful ideas, and it really has helped me and clarify, crystallize in my mind what I need to do to improve the planting in my top borders. So in recent years, Olivia and I have visited lots of the RHS show gardens. We've been to Chelsea and we've been to Tatton. And in fact, we're going to Tatton next weekend, and that will be the next video that we do. And Tatton is great because it's full of gardens designed predominantly by new and up-and-coming young designers. So it's quite exciting from that point of view, just to get a fresh look of how gardening is going to be in the future. And Olivia loves it because a lot of the students that she's at university with, the older students and the ones that are coming to the end of the course, have designed some of the gardens there, so it's particularly pertinent and personal for her to go there. But what I would say about show gardens is that they're quite transient, in that they're built to look good for that particular show, for that particular week in the year. And so, and although a lot of them do go on to more permanent homes, for us, the public, we really only see them for that particular week. So I do visit other gardens like the National Trust gardens, but what I find with those, they're on a sort of large scale. They're like capability brine type of grand vistas and lakes and things like that. And sometimes the National Trust gardens, for me recently, I'm finding that sometimes the planting hasn't been that inspirational. So I find that I like the planting styles more at the show gardens. So for me, Bridgewater was the garden that I needed to see, in that it's designed by an eminent landscape architect, someone who's top in his field. Tom Stuart-Smith won an OBE recently for his services to landscape architecture. He's a a garden designer, landscape architect and writer, and he specialises in naturalism and modernity. And the garden that he has designed for RHS Bridgewater, unlike his Chelsea show gardens, is a garden, it's a living, breathing, real garden that we can visit at any time of the year. And so for that reason, he had to make sure all the planting in there really looked good throughout the seasons, because it is going to be seen by the public all of the year through. And so my idea is that if I really study the plants that he's used, the exact plants he's used, how he's done it, then perhaps we can crack the code and unlock the key to better planting in our own gardens at home. One of the reasons for doing this video is for my own benefit, but I hope that you will find the process helpful too. I'm determined to redesign my long herbaceous borders in the autumn, and I'm really trying to get them right for next summer. I've had 2 years where they've looked beautiful in May and June, but then by this time of year they look really patchy and sort of incoherent, lots of big gaps. And then by September the dahlias are coming out and it starts to look quite nice again, but it's still patchy in places. And in the spring I tried to make some amendments. I had 2 phloxes that I just didn't want. One was a white phlox and one was this sort of pink muddy looking kind of phlox, which didn't look great. So I decided I would remove them, and I set about doing that in the spring. The trouble in the spring, after the winter weather and the frost, it sometimes becomes quite difficult to know what things are. And I dug out what I thought was the phlox, and I moved the monarda, much loved monarda, to a different spot in the border. But now, looking at the borders, I realised I have made a big mistake. So instead of removing the phlox, I removed the monarda and got rid of it. And I split the phlox and created more of it. So I've got more of a plant that I didn't want, and the border at that end is looking awful. So I think the tendency when filming videos for YouTube or photos for Instagram is to film all the good bits and perhaps gloss over the bad. But in this video, I really must focus on what's not working if we are to make positive change for the future. And I really value all your comments that I get from you. And you've taught me so much just since I started the channel. Honestly, I've learned so much, and sometimes just a little comment can spark something in me that kind of sort of unlocks something that's not been working, and I realise what I've been doing wrong. So keep the comments coming. Absolutely love getting them, and I love hearing about all your experiences, and together we can share our knowledge and grow as gardeners, both in the physical sense and the metaphorical sense too. So enough chat, and I think let's begin by looking at each of the points in detail which Bridgewater has taught me. So number 1 is repetition. So we saw in RHS Bridgewater the same plants used again and again and again, things like heleniums, eryngiums, sanguisorba, geraniums, thylictrums, crocosmias, grasses, veronicastrum and eupatoriums. The use of the same plant gives an area cohesion and allows your eye to sort of bounce along the borders, and it means that nothing kind of stands out and jars. And you can see in my borders there are so many different plants, too many different plants, and just sort of one clump of each. And therefore what I need to do is to remove some of the plants I don't like the phlox, and repeat the ones that do work well, and choose ones that work well in our soil type as well. So things that are thriving, repeat them, go with the things that work. And the second point to consider is planting in large drifts. So plant big clumps of the same plant. It looks so much more impactful, and this is especially true up in the big borders, which are viewed from a distance. Quite often they're viewed from a long way off, and I think these borders up close in here where I've spoken about, they look quite good because you're up close to them and you can appreciate the smaller plants, the detail of the smaller plants. But up in the large border I find that smaller things just get absolutely lost. And I think we saw like the Verbena bonariensis, which is peppered throughout my borders because it sells seeds everywhere, but there they definitely clumped them together and it just looked so much more impactful. And we saw these vast clumps of heleniums, that looked really good planted en masse. And I think as a sort of amateur gardener, it's quite an easy mistake to do, isn't it? To go to a garden centre or a nursery and to see a plant, oh, that looks nice, and buy one. Because it's expensive to buy, we should buy, you know, we get told that we should plant in threes. So for me, planting in the big borders up the top, if I wanted to plant one clump on each side, I would have to buy 6 of the same plants. Well, that can work out quite a lot of money. So perhaps the way to get round that is we can grow our own perennials from seed. And I've actually done that this year with a salvia called Salvia viridis. I grew it from seed and it produced loads and loads of plants, which has meant that I've been able to plant in much larger clumps than I would have done had I just bought one plant from a nursery. And the other thing to do is to try and go to, rather than go to garden centres, which tend to be more expensive, but is to try and go to a nursery, which they tend to sell plants you know, a lot, they can be a lot cheaper, so that's a good way of doing it. But even better if it's a plant that you've already got, and I find a lot of the plants at Bridgewater, which I'll come on to in a minute, are plants that I've already got. So if you've got them in the garden, then dig them up and split them and you've got their plants for free. And as we come on to point number 3, one of the problems that I've had with planting in large drifts is that if that plant, it looks good en masse, I agree, but when that plant goes over, then you have a bigger hole in the border that looks awful and it's not performing. So the key in the next point is to plant plants that have got a very long season of interest, that give you the flower power for much, much longer. And the plants chosen at RHS Garden Bridgewater were all plants that have this long season of interest. And they don't just come and go. They're not this transient plant, but they're ones that have good staying power. So they've got a long flowering season, such as heleniums and eryngiums and sanguisorba, all those, and even a eupatorium. But they're all plants that have really lovely seed heads as well. So not only do they look good in the summer months, but they also look really good in autumn and also going into winter when they're covered in ice and even snow. So that's the key, is to choose plants that look good for longer. And the next point, number 4, was grasses. So we saw that the grasses were central to the design of the borders at Bridgewater. And I know a lot of amateur gardeners seem to steer away from grasses and say that they don't like them, particularly perhaps older people. I tend to find they really don't like grasses. Perhaps they were sort of out of fashion when they were younger, I don't know, but perhaps a lot of it is to do with that we don't know perhaps much about them, and I would say that was definitely true of me. I was put off with grasses early on because I had a pampas grass in our last garden, which was huge. It was about the size of a car, and we decided it got so big and so ugly looking that we had to remove it, and it was an absolute nightmare to get out. So I think that definitely put me off grasses for a while. I also had a ribbon grass, which I brought from my last house because it looked pretty, but it got bigger and bigger and bigger and more fibrous and really difficult to manage. And the other grass that I had was pheasant grass, which is a beautiful grass. It's lovely, but I find that it's self-seeded all over the garden, and that really put me off grasses. So that initial experience of grasses really put me off. But there are so many different types of grasses, all with different, like flowers, all with different habits that do well on certain conditions and not so good on others. So do a bit of research and find out which grasses you like and which ones would perform well in your garden. And I have done a video on the grasses that we have growing in this garden, and I don't know loads about grasses, but I'm definitely learning, and I love the interest that grasses bring to the border. They provide movement, and without them the planting can be very static and rather uninteresting. And I'm a real convert to grasses. I absolutely love them now, and I find that all gardens designed by professional landscape designers and architects always feature grasses, because they recognise that they are an absolutely essential mix in the border. And my top borders have got 3 Stipa giganteas in them, and I kind of thought that because I've got 3 big clumps of the Stipa in the borders, that I shouldn't really put any more grasses in. But I'm now rethinking that, because there are so many types of grasses and they all look so different as much as flowers look different. So I think it is possible to have perhaps add more grasses into the mix as well. So I will consider that. And at RHS Bridgewater I saw two very beautiful grasses that I really loved, but I just couldn't find the plant label anywhere for them. And so I posted a picture of them on, well, you saw on the YouTube channel, and I was delighted when somebody was able to identify what both of them were. So the first one was this really light, very airy grass, quite magical little grass actually, and it is called Stipa pulcherrima, and it means, pulcherrima means very beautiful, and it was very beautiful. And it was planted alongside with a direct contrast of a very spiky plant. This was a spiky Limonium latifolium. Limonium means meadow, incidentally. I looked all these up in my botany book. And the other one that I really loved and kept raving on about in the video was this very tactile grass, and it's a Melica ciliate. And Melica means grass and ciliate means fringed with hairs, and it was like a little doggy or a little cat or something that you just wanted to stroke. It was so lovely and soft and tactile. So thank you very much for helping me identify those. So number 5 on my list is the position of the plants, and one of the things I was really excited to see was a lot of the plants growing beautifully at RHS Garden Bridgewater were plants that I already have in my garden, but it perhaps made me realise that a lot of them I have growing in the wrong situation and they don't really look good where they are. We saw plants like heleniums, which I have, eupatorium, hylotelethum and solidago, all of which I have, but seeing them there I realised that I have in some instances been growing them entirely in the wrong way. So we saw lots of veronicastrum, and to be honest, veronicastrum isn't a plant that I've rated particularly highly. I have got a clump growing by the fence line under the hornbeam, and it was planted originally in full sun, but with the addition of the second row of hornbeam it's now cast in pretty much full shade, and because of this it's leaning in, trying to get to the light, which I didn't really notice and realise. But seeing it at Bridgewater made me see the plant in a new light. And the other thing, it's got these very funny looking deformed flower heads, and a comment from one of you, John, on YouTube, he commented and said that his has got these deformed flower heads too, and this is called fasciation, where the plants, in response to stress, they produce these disfigured flower head. And I now realise that my poor plant is experiencing lots of stress. Fasciation can happen as a result of several reasons, but it results in mutation of the cells of the plant, and veronicastrums are particularly prone to this. And it happens for perhaps harsh weather or fungal and viral diseases, but stressing the plant and growing it in the wrong conditions could be the result of why mine is doing it. And so when I realise the error of my ways, and I realise I'm a very cruel plant mummy, and I do need to move it to a happier place, which I will do in the autumn. And the next thing that we saw at Bridgewater was really nice use of ground cover plants. We saw some great ideas for ground cover. There were the usual things like geraniums. We saw geranium orion, epimediums, which are lovely, and the haconocloa, also a grass and also looks good as a ground cover. And I have recently bought some haconocloa because I've seen it used such a lot in different gardens, and I think it looks lovely. But the other rather unusual plant that we saw used for ground cover was this Keringoshoma. Ki means yellow, ring means lotus blossom, and shoma means hat. So it describes this plant very well, but I've never seen this plant before, but Keringoshoma looked to be a lovely plant which gave these lovely shaped leaves and provided a bit of interest. So that brings us on to the next point. And the next point is using colour and contrast. So colour can be used in different ways, and I'm sure a lot of you know this already, but you can use colours which are next to each other on the colour wheel, such as pinks and purples, or perhaps reds, oranges and yellows, and they create this very harmonious effect. But you can also mix things up a bit and use colours that are opposite on the colour wheel. So things like purple and yellow look really good together, or orange and blue. And by using this effect, you could create a much more dynamic look and perhaps a punchier feel. The other thing you can do to create contrast is to have contrasting shapes and contrasting leaf forms. And we saw this done very well by Tom Stuart-Smith, perhaps showing off his skill. He used just one tone, so it was like a yellowy, greeny tone. And in this border, he used lots of different shapes of leaves and different forms of plants to create the contrast, and it worked really well, and that's something that I would never ever have considered doing. But you can perhaps do this not in such an obvious way, but in a more subtle way, but using spiky plants, which we saw with the in the point before, used with very soft plants, or very big leaves used with very small leaves. So giving contrast to the border, so having things that look different in their shape, form, as well as in their colours as well. And number 8, which perhaps kind of reiterates what we've just said in the last point, but this point is all about using very architectural plants, and Tom Stuart-Smith does this very well. He used Catalpa herbaceous purpurea, which is Indian bean tree, and also the Palomino, which is the foxglove tree. Both of these are trees, but we're placed amongst the herbaceous borders, and we're used to give the wow factor and provide strong architectural form. Both of these can be coppiced to keep them in check and at the desired size for herbaceous border. And I loved particularly the Catalpa, but I know that they can reach up to 12 metres or 40 feet in height, and I didn't know that they could be coppiced. And by doing this, this encourages the leaves to become larger, and they look really, really great, and they would give that contrast which we mentioned in the last point as well, planted with other colours and other sizes of leaves, smaller leaf forms. And you can see also that architectural form comes in the form of these metal structures which look really good and frame a view through them too. And here you can see them with the architectural domes of the yew. And this picture just views, this is an old picture from when it was all just planted, and you can see how well the architectural forms work together to create this overall strong structure. And the next point is beautiful trees. So while we're on the subject of trees, I just loved particularly the Parotia persica trees. We saw this pleached at this garden, and we also saw it growing as a standard tree. And I saw this tree for the first time when we went to Chelsea, when they had the Autumn Chelsea, which was just after COVID. And it was a great Chelsea because it focused a lot on trees, and we saw this tree appear again and again, and it's a beautiful tree. And to be honest, had sort of forgotten about it, and seeing it again at RHS Bridgewater made me remember just what a fabulous tree it is. It's a small tree reaching just 8 metres or 26 feet. It has an attractive flaking bark. The leaves turn yellow, red and purple in the autumn, and it produces small crimson flowers on its bare twigs. It's really unfussy and can tolerate sun or partial shade in any aspect, exposed or sheltered, and its hardiness is H6 or USDA 4 through 7. It is a stunning tree with a long season of interest, and it was interesting to see that although we saw it in July, the leaves were already producing lovely colours of red, yellows and greens, and it looked stunning. Another tree that we saw, and one that I had never seen before or even heard of, was a Zelkova serrata. It looked lovely, and we saw it growing as a multi-stem variety just by the entrance. It's a slow growing tree and gets to about 12 metres in height, which is 39 feet, with a spread of about 2.5 to 4 metres or 8 feet to 13 feet, and it takes more than 50 years to reach its ultimate height, so it's quite slow growing. It likes any soil type, moist but well-drained soil in any pH, full sun or partial shade, and it can be growing in any aspect, but it will prefer a more sheltered site. USDA 4 through 7 and hardiness H6. And number 10 are anchor plants. So we saw certain plants used to sort of anchor the garden to its surroundings, and these were used repeatedly again and again, such as large yew domes in the grass, planted in the grass. And we also saw these beech beehives planted in the borders. And like we discussed when we talked about repeating the same planting, this gives cohesion and encourages the eye to sort of bounce along the view rather than focus on one area. But number 11, in direct contrast to sort of anchor plants and which encourage travelling along the view, focal plants do something different. They draw the eye to a particular point, and we saw this done very well with the catalpa and the poloina, which we've already mentioned. They naturally sort of pulled me towards them. So we need to think when we plant our borders what it is we want the viewer of the garden to do. Do we want them to stroll along the border, or do we want the plants to sort of coexist next to each other in the border, or do we want to have something that really stands out? So the very last point, number 12 on my list, is zoning an area. And this point is perhaps less relevant to me and planting my large borders, but may resonate with you if you're in the design phase of your garden. I think it's worth pointing this out because it was done very well. So if you wish to create an intimate area within a larger, more open space, then consider using plants to create the effect. We've done it ourselves using pleach trees, and it gives immediate height and it also provides division without a very permanent barrier. And in Bridgewater we saw this done extremely well using pleach trees also, but these were pleach Parotia persica trees. I don't think my husband will take kindly to me having more pleach trees, as we already have 3 rows, but I love the feel of this area and the way the muted colours of the Yorkshire stone, which was used around the Parotia persica trees, really made the leaves pop and really stand out. And this was also mirrored in the surrounding planting, in the purples of the planting, and it really gave this beautiful Mediterranean feel and certainly evoked the feeling that was intended of one of a paradise garden, which this garden is. So I think we've reached the end of the video, and I hope you find these points helpful. And so I'm going to try and put into practice all that I've learned at Bridgewater. And if you like what we do and you're learning along with me, then don't forget to like and subscribe. We've got some really exciting videos coming up. In the next video, we're going to be discussing our trip to the Tatton Flower Show, which we're going to tomorrow actually, and the video will be out next weekend. And then following on from that, we've got a tour to Stretton Old Hall, another wonderful garden, and we're going to have a chat with the head gardener there, who will hopefully be able to give us more tips and tricks as well. And as I mentioned before, I have some really exciting news to tell you. So as I said, I intend to go back to Woollerton Old Hall to do a video on Woollerton's planting as well, but I did contact Leslie Jenkins and John, who own the garden, to ask would they be interested in doing just a little interview, a little chat about their garden, and they said they would absolutely love to. So I'm really excited that we will get the opportunity to quiz Leslie and John and find out how they managed to create such an exquisite garden, and perhaps I'd like to get some ideas of how to get my planting right from an expert too. So keep tuned and watch out for this up and coming video. Thank you very much for watching, and join us again in the next video. Bye for now.